Her name was Cordelia Beaumont, and she arrived at the Blackwood Ranch with nothing but a spent horse and the clothes on her back, hunted by a past she couldn't outrun. She was a ghost of a woman, all fine breeding worn down to raw nerve and desperation. She asked the rancher, a young Lakota man with eyes that held the entire unforgiving prairie, for a job, any job. He stood there, a silhouette against the bleeding sun, and gave her an answer that would either be her salvation or her final damnation. I have a job for you. Only if you'll marry me by sunset. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth of the Dakota Territory. Cordelia Beaumont felt its heat not just on her skin, but deep in her bones, a fever that matched the one in her soul. For 3 days, she had ridden west, pushing her bay mare, Persephone, to the brink of collapse. Her once fine riding habit was torn and stained with sweat and alkali dust. The carefully coiled chignon she'd left St. Louis with had long since surrendered to a wild, tangled mane of chestnut hair that whipped across her face. She was running from a man whose name was a brand on the world she'd escaped, Bartholomew Thorne, a man of immense wealth and influence, whose charm was a silken glove over an iron fist. He was her fiancé, a match orchestrated by her father to merge fortunes. To the world, he was a pillar of society. To Cordelia, in the suffocating privacy of their courtship, he was a cage maker, his affection a series of locks clicking shut. The final lock had been his casual mention of sending her to a restful sanatorium in the mountains after their wedding, a place for women of delicate constitutions and overactive minds. She knew it for what it was, a beautiful prison where she would be silenced forever. So she had fled, taking only Persephone and a small satchel, with a handful of dollars and a water skin. Now, both the money and the water were gone. Persephone's head hung low, her breath coming in ragged, shallow rasps. Cordelia's own throat was a desert, and her vision swam with dark spots. Ahead, shimmering in the heat haze, was the first sign of life she'd seen in a day. A low-slung ranch house, a sturdy barn, and a web of corrals. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. It was an island in a sea of desolation. It was her last chance. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the barn. He was tall and moved with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with the harshness of the land. He wore practical denim trousers and a simple cotton shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal powerfully corded forearms, the skin the rich, warm color of polished copper. His black hair was tied back at the nape of his neck with a leather thong. He was young, perhaps no more than 25, but his eyes, when he finally turned them on her, were ancient. They were the color of dark, wet earth after a storm, and they held no welcome, only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. Cordelia slid from the saddle, her legs buckling beneath her. She clung to Persephone's side for support, the horse's heaving flank a comfort against her own trembling body. I need water," she croaked, her voice a stranger's, a dry rustle of leaves. "For my horse." The man said nothing. He walked toward them, his steps measured and silent. He ran a knowing hand down Persephone's lathered neck, then lifted one of her forelegs, examining the hoof. He looked at the brand on the mare's flank, a simple B for Beaumont. Then his eyes flickered back to Cordelia, taking in her tattered finery and the desperation etched onto her face. "She's been ridden too hard," he stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. He led the horse toward a trough by the well, his movements economical and sure. Persephone drank greedily, her sides expanding and contracting. Cordelia followed, her shadow long and skeletal in the late afternoon sun. "Thank you," My name is Cordelia. She omitted her surname. It was too dangerous. He still didn't offer his own name. He pumped a dipper of cool water from the well and handed it to her. It was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank it down, the cold shocking her system, clearing some of the fog from her mind. "I'm looking for work," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush before her courage could fail. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend clothes. I'm a hard worker, I swear it. I don't need much, just a place to stay and a small wage." The man leaned against the well, crossing his arms over his broad chest. The posture was casual, but his eyes were anything but. They roamed over her, not with lust, but with an unnerving, analytical intensity, as if he were assessing livestock. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her temple, partially hidden by her hair, where Thorn had grabbed her a week ago. He saw the terror that she tried to mask with defiance. He saw the quality of the fabric in her ruined dress and the soft, uncalloused skin of her hands. "You're no cook or maid," he said, his voice a low baritone, smooth but with a hard edge. "You're a lady, and ladies running this far into the territory are running from something bad. Or someone." Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs. "I can learn. I will do any work you ask." "This is a horse ranch," he said, gesturing to the sprawling pastures beyond the corrals. "The work is hard. It breaks men, let alone ladies." The condescension in that last word was a spark on dry tinder. "Then let me break," she shot back, her own voice surprising her with its fire. "It is my own back to offer. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a job." He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the creak of the windmill and the thirsty slurping of her horse. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. He seemed to be watching it, his expression unreadable. "My name is Kalen Blackwood," he said finally. His eyes met hers again, and the intensity in them pinned her to the spot. "And you're right. You're not asking for charity. You're asking for protection." She flinched, the truth of his words hitting her like a physical blow. "The man you're running from," Kalen continued, his voice dropping lower, "he'll have resources. He'll have trackers. Men like that don't let their property go. A lone woman working on a ranch owned by a half Lakota man. He'll find you within a week. The sheriff in Redemption Creek is a good man, but he bends to the will of money. Your fiancé will drag you back, and no one will lift a finger to stop him." Every word was a nail in her coffin. He saw her situation with terrifying clarity. Despair, cold and absolute, began to wash over her. This was it. This was the end of the line. "But there is a way," Kalen said, pushing himself off the well. He stepped closer, and she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He smelled of horse, leather, and the clean, dry scent of the prairie. "There is one law in this territory that even men like him hesitate to break outright, the sanctity of a marriage." Cordelia stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you saying?" The sun touched the horizon, its light bathing his face in golden shadow, carving his high cheekbones and strong jaw into sharp relief. He looked like a bronze statue of some ancient, forgotten god. "I have a job for you," he said, his voice utterly serious, devoid of any hint of mockery or romance. "The position of my wife. It will give you my name, the protection of this ranch, and a legal standing that will make it very difficult for him to touch you." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Only if you'll marry me by sunset." The world tilted on its axis. The proposal was monstrous, insane. It was a trade of one cage for another. He was a stranger, a man whose heritage made him an outcast in the very world she sought to hide in. To marry him would be to sever her last tie to the life she knew, to become something wholly other. But then she thought of Bartholomew Thorne's cold smile and the dead look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She thought of the sanatorium, of the silence, of the slow death of her mind. Kaelin Blackwood was offering her a cage, yes, but it was a cage of her own choosing. And out here, on this vast, empty prairie, perhaps this cage had a door. She looked at the sun, a fiery sliver now disappearing below the earth. She had minutes to decide. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" His expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something, weariness perhaps, passed through his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to have men like Bartholomew Thorne try to take what is yours," he said. "This ranch, this land, they see it and they want it. They see me, and they see an obstacle, a wife, a family. It makes a man look more permanent, more civilized in their eyes. It makes him harder to erase." He gave a humorless smile. "You need an anchor and I need a wall. This is a business proposition, Miss Cordelia. Nothing more." The last sliver of the sun vanished. The sky deepened into a bruised purple. He was right. It wasn't a proposal of the heart. It was a treaty signed in desperation on a battlefield. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. She met his gaze, the gaze of the man who would be her husband, her employer, her protector, her captor. "Yes," she said. The word hung in the twilight air between them, fragile yet unbreakable. "Yes." Kaelin didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand or a comforting word. He simply nodded, a curt, decisive movement, as if concluding a cattle deal. The pragmatism of it was both chilling and, in a strange way, reassuring. This was not about emotion. It was about survival. "My foreman, Hector, has ridden into Redemption Creek for supplies," Kaelin said, his tone all business. "He'll be back within the hour. He's a witness. The circuit judge, a man named Patterson, is staying at the boarding house. He's a drunk, but his signature is legal. We'll ride in and have it done." Cordelia swayed, the finality of her decision crashing down on her. "Now? Tonight?" The offer was by sunset, he reminded her, though the sun was already gone, its memory a pale orange smear on the horizon. "The longer you are here as a single woman, the more questions will be asked. Tomorrow, a rider from Thorne could appear. By then you will be Mrs. Blackwood. It will be a fact, solid as the earth beneath our feet." He turned and strode toward the barn, calling out, "Hector!" An older man emerged from the shadows of the tack room. He was wiry and weathered, with a face like a dried apple and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He wiped his hands on an oily rag, his gaze flicking from Kaelin to Cordelia and back again, a silent question in his look. "Hector, this is Cordelia," Kaelin announced. "She'll be staying. Saddle 2 horses. We're riding to town." Hector's eyebrows, thick and grey, shot up. He looked at Cordelia's state of dress, the exhaustion clinging to her like a shroud, and the fine-boned desperation in her face. He was clearly a man of few words, but his expression spoke volumes of suspicion and disapproval. He'd seen women like her before, trouble that blew in with the storm and left ruin in its wake. But he merely grunted. "The roan for the lady?" "Yes, and saddle my stallion." Kaelin disappeared into the ranch house without another word, leaving Cordelia standing awkwardly under Hector's scrutinizing gaze. "The boss ain't one for strays," Hector finally mumbled, more to himself than to her, as he headed for the corral. Humankind, anyway. The implication was clear. Cordelia was something wild and unpredictable, and Hector didn't trust her. She couldn't blame him. She didn't trust herself. When Kaelan returned, he was carrying a simple, clean dress of dark blue calico and a pair of worn but sturdy boots. He held them out to her. "These belong to my mother. They should fit well enough. You can change in the house." He gestured to the simple, solid structure. It was made of thick timber, built to withstand the punishing winds and winters of the plains. She entered alone. The inside was sparse, clean and masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A long table with 4 chairs stood in the center of the main room. Bookshelves filled with worn volumes by Shakespeare, Emerson, and Thoreau stood next to shelves holding practical manuals on animal husbandry and engineering. It was a space that reflected the complexity of its owner, a man of the earth and a man of the mind. In a small, private room, she washed her face and hands in a basin of cool water. The blue dress was a little loose in the waist and a little short in the arms, but it was clean and whole. It felt like shedding a skin. She was no longer Cordelia Beaumont, the runaway fiancée. In this dress, she was someone else, someone anonymous, someone about to become a wife. When she emerged, Kaelan and Hector were waiting with the horses. Kaelan looked at her, his expression unchanged, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes as he took in the sight of her in his mother's dress. He simply handed her the reins to the roan mare and mounted his own horse, a magnificent black stallion that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. The ride to Redemption Creek was conducted in near total silence, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the chirping of crickets. The moon had risen, a perfect silver coin in a sea of stars, illuminating the vast, empty landscape. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Cordelia felt like a speck of dust, a meaningless thing in this immense space. Beside her, Kaelan rode with an easy confidence, a part of the landscape, not an intruder upon it. Redemption Creek was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and a boarding house. Lamplight spilled from the windows of the saloon, along with the tinny sound of a piano and raucous laughter. It was a town clinging precariously to the edge of civilization. Kaelan dismounted in front of the boarding house and tied their horses to the hitching rail. "Wait here." He went inside. Through the window, Cordelia could see him speaking to a portly, red-faced man in a rumpled suit. The man, presumably Judge Patterson, shook his head at first, but then Kaelan placed a small, heavy pouch on the table. The judge's demeanor changed instantly. He picked up the pouch, nodded, and followed Kaelan outside. Judge Patterson reeked of cheap whiskey and sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, but they held a spark of greedy intelligence. He looked Cordelia up and down, a leering appraisal that made her skin crawl. "So, Blackwood, you've finally decided to get yourself a wife," the judge slurred, a smirk on his face. "And a pretty one at that, though she looks like she's been dragged through a keyhole backwards." Kaelan stepped slightly, placing himself between Cordelia and the judge's gaze. "Just the papers, Patterson. And the vow." The judge shrugged, pulling a worn, leather-bound book and a pen from his coat pocket. He opened it on the back of Cordelia's mare, the horse shifting nervously. All right. No need to get touchy. Name? Kaelan Blackwood. And you, girlie? Cordelia?" "Blackwood," she said, the name feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. The judge grunted, scribbling in the book. "Hector, you're the witness?" Hector, who had remained silent and watchful, simply nodded. "Right then," the judge said, clearing his throat with a theatrical cough. "By the power vested in me by the Dakota Territory, do you, Kaelan Blackwood, take this woman, Cordelia, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Kaelan's voice was steady and clear in the cool night air. I do. The judge turned his bleary eyes to Cordelia. And do you, Cordelia, take this man, Caelan Blackwood, to be your lawfully wedded husband? This was it. The precipice. She looked at Caelan. His face was a mask of stoicism in the moonlight, impossible to read. He was offering her a shield, not a heart, a name, not a home, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. It was a chance. I do, she whispered. Fine. You're hitched, Patterson declared, slamming the book shut. That'll be all. He pocketed the pen and turned to go back inside, already thinking of his next drink. There was no ring, no kiss, no pronouncement. Just a drunken scrawl in a dusty book on a horse's back in a frontier town. She was married. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride in. The reality of her situation settled upon her, heavy and suffocating. She had just bound herself to a complete stranger. A man the world saw as less than a man because of his blood. What had she done? When they arrived back at the ranch house, Caelan dismounted and took the reins of her horse. Hector will see to the mare, he said. You should get some rest. There are 2 rooms in the house. The one on the left is my mother's. It's yours now. He was giving her a separate room. The small courtesy was a profound relief. It reinforced the nature of their agreement. This was a contract, not a union of bodies or souls. Thank you, she said softly. He merely nodded and led the horses toward the barn, his broad back a stark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Cordelia went inside the silent house. She found the room he had indicated. It was small and simple, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden wardrobe, and a washstand. A single window looked out onto the vast, dark prairie. It was more a cell than a bedroom, but it was safe. For the first time in days, she could breathe without the paralyzing fear of being hunted. She lay down on the bed, still in the calico dress, too exhausted to undress. She was no longer Cordelia Beaumont, the fiancée of a powerful man. She was Cordelia Blackwood, the wife of a stranger. She had traded one unknown future for another. As sleep finally claimed her, she didn't know if she had saved herself or merely chosen a different kind of damnation. The first few days of Cordelia's marriage were a study in silent coexistence. Caelan was a ghost in his own house. He rose before the sun, his quiet movements barely disturbing the stillness, and was gone by the time she awoke. He spent his days on the range with Hector and 2 other hands, a young Mexican boy named Mateo and a taciturn old-timer called Gus. They were a small, loyal crew, men who judged Caelan by his character, not his bloodline. Cordelia, determined to uphold her end of the bargain, threw herself into the work she had promised to do. The house, though clean, had lacked a woman's touch for years. She aired out the rooms, scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, and tackled the mountain of mending she found in a basket. She discovered a well-stocked pantry and, using a worn cookbook she found on a shelf, began preparing meals. Her first attempt at a stew was a watery, tasteless affair. When Caelan came in that evening, filthy and bone-weary, he ate it without complaint, his expression giving nothing away. The silence at the dinner table was a physical presence, thick and uncomfortable. They were husband and wife in name only, 2 strangers sharing a roof and a table, separated by an impassable gulf of unspoken words. The second night, her biscuits were as hard as rocks. The third, the beans were scorched. Each failure was a small humiliation. She was proving him right. She was a useless lady. But she persisted, her jaw set with a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed. On the fourth day, as she kneaded dough for another attempt at bread, she saw a plume of dust on the horizon. It was not the familiar, small cloud of Kalen and his men. This was larger, more deliberate. 2 riders, moving at a steady, purposeful pace toward the ranch. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up her spine. They were here. Thorn had found her. She ran to the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked out toward the pastures, but Kalen was too far away to see, a distant figure on horseback. She was alone. The riders drew closer, resolving into 2 large, grim-faced men on powerful horses. They wore expensive leather and holstered Colt revolvers high on their hips. The man in the lead had a cruel, pinched face and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes, small and hard as pebbles, sweeping over her with contemptuous ownership. "We're looking for a woman," the man said, his voice a low growl. "A Miss Cordelia Beaumont. Came this way on a tired bay mare. We have reason to believe she's being held here." Cordelia's hands clenched in the fabric of her apron. Her first instinct was to run, to hide. But where? She thought of Kalen's words. "You will be Mrs. Blackwood. It will be a fact, solid as the earth." She lifted her chin, praying her voice wouldn't betray her terror. "There is no Miss Beaumont here," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected. The man smirked, a thoroughly unpleasant expression. "Is that so? Funny. You match her description perfectly. Mr. Thorne is very worried about her. He's offering a handsome reward for her safe return." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Maybe you'd like to claim it yourself, ma'am, and save us all a lot of trouble." "My name is Cordelia Blackwood," she stated, putting as much ice in her tone as she could muster. "This is my husband's ranch. I think you've made a mistake." The second man chuckled, a nasty, wheezing sound. "Blackwood? You married that half-breed. Lady, you must have been in a powerful hurry." The insult, aimed at Kalen, ignited a spark of fury in her. Before she could retort, another voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "Is there a problem here?" Kalen had approached without a sound, his black stallion moving like a shadow across the parched grass. He was holding a Winchester rifle, its stock resting casually on his thigh, but the barrel was pointing in their general direction. Hector, Mateo, and Gus were fanned out behind him, their own expressions grim, their own rifles held at the ready. The lead rider straightened in his saddle, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Bartholomew Thorne. We're looking for his fiancée." "You've been misinformed," Kalen said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my wife, Mrs. Blackwood. You are trespassing on my land." The man, whose name she would later learn was Gideon Reed, Thorne's formidable foreman, sneered openly. "A marriage certificate from some drunk judge in a backwater town doesn't mean a thing. Mr. Thorne considers the lady his property. He wants her back." "She is not property," Kalen replied, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. "She is my wife. The law is clear on that, even out here. Now I'm telling you for the last time. Leave my land." Reed's eyes narrowed, glittering with malice. He was a man used to getting his way through brute force and intimidation. He looked from Kalen to his men, then back to Cordelia on the porch. He was calculating the odds. 4 armed ranchers against his 2 men. It wasn't a fight he could win easily. "This ain't over, Breed," Reed snarled, spitting a wad of tobacco juice into the dust near Kalen's horse. "Mr. Thorne will hear about this. He doesn't forget. And he doesn't forgive." With a final venomous glare at Cordelia, Reed yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, his partner close behind, leaving a trail of dust and silent threats hanging in the air. The tension broke. Cordelia's knees felt weak, and she gripped the porch railing for support. Hector and the others lowered their rifles, relief visible on their faces. Kaelin dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were dark with a controlled anger. "Are you all right?" he asked. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. She had faced down Thorn's wolves, and with Kaelin's help, she had won. But it was only the first battle. Reed's threat echoed in her mind. This ain't over. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was no longer empty and awkward. It was charged with the day's events. Cordelia had made a chicken and dumpling stew, and this time it was perfect. The biscuits were light and fluffy. She had found her rhythm in the kitchen, just as she was beginning to find a fragile footing in this new life. Kaelin ate with his usual quiet focus, but she felt his eyes on her more than once. When the meal was over, he didn't rise to leave immediately as he usually did. "You were brave today," he said, the words so unexpected they startled her. "I was terrified," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he countered, looking at her directly. "It's acting in spite of it. You stood your ground. You used my name as the shield it was meant to be." For the first time, she saw something beyond the stoic rancher. She saw a man who understood the nuances of fear and courage, a man who had clearly faced his own share of both. "He will not give up," she said, the fear returning. "Bartholomew is not a man who accepts defeat. He will be back." "I know," Kaelin said. His jaw tightened. "He won't come at you directly again. Not right away. He'll be smarter than that. He'll come at me." The implication hung in the air. Thorn would try to destroy Kaelin to get to her. She was no longer just a runaway. She was the cause of a war between two powerful, determined men. Her desperate bid for freedom had not just endangered herself, but this man, his home, and the few people loyal to him. The weight of that guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate. "I've brought this trouble to your door." Kaelin looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "Trouble was already here," he said quietly. "Men like Thorn have been trying to take this land from my family for generations. You're not the cause of this war, Cordelia. You're just the latest battle." He had used her first name. It was the first time he had spoken it since their wedding night. In the quiet lamplight of the ranch house, with the vast, dangerous darkness pressing in from all sides, it felt less like a name and more like an acknowledgement, a recognition that they were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract, but allies in a fight that had just begun. The confrontation with Gideon Reed had changed things. The unspoken contract between Cordelia and Kaelin was now sealed in shared danger. A subtle shift occurred in the dynamics of the ranch. Hector's perpetual scowl softened into a look of grudging respect. Mateo, the young hand, began to greet her with a shy smile, and even crusty old Gus would tip his hat when she brought water out to the corrals. She was no longer just the boss's strange new wife. She was the woman who had faced down Thorn's men and hadn't flinched. Kaelin, too, began to change. He still maintained a careful distance, but he started speaking to her more, his conversation no longer limited to curt necessities. He would tell her about the horses, explaining the strengths of a certain bloodline or the temperament of a new foal. He pointed out the distant landmarks from the porch, the Wolfjaw buttes to the east, the Serpent River that snaked through the southern valley. He was, in his own reserved way, showing her the world he called home, the land he was willing to fight for. A week after Reed's visit, the need for supplies became unavoidable. Kaelin announced his intention to ride into Redemption Creek. "I should come with you," Cordelia said immediately. "If we are to make this marriage seem real, we must be seen together." Caelan considered this, his expression thoughtful. "The townspeople, they can be unkind. They do not trust outsiders, especially one married to me." "I have faced Bartholomew Thorne's foreman," she replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "I think I can survive the gossip of a few shopkeepers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare and startling event. "Very well. Be ready in an hour." Riding into Redemption Creek beside Caelan was a vastly different experience from her first desperate nocturnal visit. In the full light of day, the town seemed smaller, dustier, and more judgmental. As they rode down the main street, windows twitched with curtains being pulled aside. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Women gathered in small, tight knots, their whispers following them like a swarm of insects. Cordelia felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny pinpricks of curiosity and condemnation. She saw the way they looked at Caelan, a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grudging respect for the success of his ranch. He was an anomaly they couldn't categorize, an Indian who owned prime land, who was literate, who carried himself with more dignity than any of them. And now he had a white wife, a lady by the looks of her, which was the greatest transgression of all. She held her head high, her back straight in the saddle, feigning a confidence she did not feel. She was acutely aware of Caelan beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. He seemed oblivious to the stairs, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the tension in the set of his shoulders. Their first stop was the general store, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salted fish. The proprietor, a balding man named Peterson, gave them a curt nod, his eyes avoiding Caelan's. As Caelan gave his list of supplies, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, Cordelia browsed the shelves. A woman with a pinched, sour face and 2 young children in tow deliberately bumped into her. "Pardon me," Cordelia said politely. The woman looked her up and down, her lip curled in a sneer. "You should be more careful," she said loudly, for the benefit of the other customers. "Some of us aren't used to sharing our town with your kind." The insult was clearly meant to encompass both Cordelia and her marriage. The store fell silent. Cordelia could feel the color rising in her cheeks. Before she could respond, a warm, lilting voice cut through the tension. "Don't mind Martha," the voice said. "Her disposition's been sour ever since her husband's prize hog ran off with a wild razorback." Cordelia turned to see a woman with fiery red hair piled high on her head and startlingly green eyes. She was proprietor of the saloon across the street, a fact evident by her slightly more daring dress and the air of unflappable confidence around her. Her name was Maeve O'Connell, and she was the undisputed queen of Redemption Creek's social and not-so-social scene. Maeve gave Cordelia a broad, conspiratorial wink. "Pay them no mind, dear. They're just jealous because Caelan Blackwood is the only man in this territory who can read a book and rope a steer in the same day. You've got the best of the lot." She turned her attention to the glowering Martha. "Now, Martha, didn't I hear you complaining last week that the beef you bought from the Circle T was stringy enough to floss a horse's teeth? Blackwood stock is the best in the territory. Maybe you should remember who you're insulting." Martha, flustered and outmaneuvered, gathered her children and fled the store. The other customers suddenly found fascinating things to look at on the shelves. Maeve O'Connell had single-handedly diffused the situation. "Thank you," Cordelia said, genuinely grateful. "Don't mention it," Maeve said with a wave of her hand. This town needs a bit of stirring up now and then. Welcome to Redemption Creek, Mrs. Blackwood. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." She gave Caelan a familiar, friendly nod. "Caelan." "Maeve," he acknowledged, his voice even. It was clear they had a history, a long-standing understanding that transcended the town's prejudices. As they left the store, Caelan loaded the supplies onto a pack mule. "She seems formidable," Cordelia remarked. "Maeve O'Connell judges people by what's in their heads and their hearts, not the color of their skin," Caelan said. "She is a rare thing in this part of the country. She is a fair woman." Their last stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He greeted Caelan with a nod that was neither friendly nor hostile. "Blackwood," he said. "Sheriff, I wanted to inform you officially that 2 men, riders for Bartholomew Thorne, came onto my land last week. They made threats against my wife and my property." Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I heard about it. Gideon Reed was in town yesterday, asking questions, spreading money around." He looked at Cordelia. "Ma'am, you've put yourself in a difficult position." "My wife is exactly where she belongs, Sheriff," Caelan said, his voice flat and hard. "On her own property. I expect the law to recognize that." "The law recognizes many things, Caelan," Brody said, his tired eyes full of grim pragmatism. "It recognizes your marriage certificate. It also recognizes the weight of Bartholomew Thorne's gold. He owns the bank, he holds the mortgage on half the businesses in this town, and he has the ear of the territorial governor. I'm just one man with a badge. I'll do what I can, but I'm telling you to be careful. Thorne is like a rattler. He'll coil and wait, and he'll strike when you least expect it." The sheriff's warning was more chilling than Reed's open threats. It spoke of a deeper, more insidious danger, a corruption that could turn the law itself into a weapon against them. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the weight of the sheriff's words settling between them. The whispers and stares in town had been unpleasant, but the sheriff's weary resignation was terrifying. They were truly on their own. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the corners of the house. Cordelia lay in her bed, listening to the fury of the storm, feeling a kinship with its wildness. Her life had become a storm, and she was at its epicenter. A loud crash of thunder shook the house, and she sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. She heard a noise from the main room. Not the storm, but something else. A quiet human sound. A sound of pain. Clutching a candlestick, she crept out of her room. In the main room, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace, she saw Caelan. He was sitting at the table, stripped to the waist, his back to her. A bottle of whiskey and a rag were on the table beside him. In the faint, flickering light, she saw a network of old scars crisscrossing the powerful muscles of his back. But there was also a fresh wound, a long, ugly gash on his side, sluggishly bleeding. "What happened?" she gasped, rushing forward. He turned, startled, his face tight with pain. "It's nothing. A bull gored one of the fences today. It caught me when I was repairing it." "It's not nothing. You're bleeding," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. She took the rag from him. "This is filthy. Where do you keep your medical supplies?" He looked surprised by her forcefulness, but gestured to a small chest in the corner. She found what she needed: carbolic acid, clean bandages, and salves. Her mother had insisted she learn basic nursing, a skill Cordelia had once dismissed as trivial. Now, she was profoundly grateful for it. "This will sting," she warned, her voice softening. She cleaned the wound with practiced, gentle hands. He hissed as the antiseptic touched his raw flesh, but didn't pull away. As she worked, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was warm and smooth, a startling contrast to the harsh, scarred landscape of his back. She felt a sudden, unexpected jolt of intimacy, a connection that went beyond their contractual marriage. She was tending to her husband's wound. He was silent as she bandaged his side, his breathing the only sound in the room besides the storm outside. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the clean scent of the rain on his skin mixed with the sharp tang of whiskey. When she was finished, she tied off the bandage, her hands lingering for a fraction of a second on his waist. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You should have told me," she replied softly, her anger giving way to a different, more complicated emotion. "You don't have to face everything alone." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light. The carefully constructed walls between them seemed to crumble in that moment, washed away by the storm outside and the shared vulnerability within. He was not just a protector or a business partner. He was a man, wounded and proud, and she was his wife. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was a touch that promised not ownership, but a tentative, fragile beginning. The night Cordelia tended Caelan's wound, the walls between them crumbled. In the quiet days that followed, they began to speak of their pasts. He told her of his Scottish fur-trapper father and his Lakota mother, who taught him to live between two worlds. In turn, she described her life as a prized bird in a gilded cage, valued for her beauty, but never her mind. An understanding, deeper than their contract, began to grow. Determined to be a true partner, Cordelia insisted on learning the rhythms of the ranch. She learned to ride astride, and while she lacked the physical strength of the men, her sharp intellect found its purpose. Discovering Caelan's disorganized ledgers, she dedicated herself to them, uncovering years of quiet theft, buyers who underpaid, a freight agent who overcharged. She organized the accounts with ruthless efficiency, proving he was being systematically cheated. Caelan looked at her work with a new, profound respect. He had strength, but she possessed a different kind of weapon, one he desperately needed. Their burgeoning partnership was tested when a panicked ranch hand rode in, shouting that Caelan's horse had fallen in a rocky pass, pinning him. Cordelia took immediate command. She sent a rider for the doctor, while she galloped to the canyon herself. She found Caelan trapped beneath his magnificent stallion, his leg shattered, and the horse suffering a mortal injury. "Cordelia, you have to shoot him," Caelan gritted out through the pain. With tears blinding her, she raised the pistol he had taught her to use and fired, the shot echoing like a final, merciful sob. For the next week, she was his tireless nurse, tending to his broken body as he battled fever and infection. In his delirium, he would cry out in Lakota, his mind lost in the past. One night, he grabbed her wrist, his eyes unfocused. "Wanacha," he whispered, mistaking her for his mother. "No, Caelan," she said softly, her heart aching for his pain. "It's Cordelia, it's your wife." His eyes cleared, the fever breaking. In that moment, he saw her not as a party to a contract, but as the woman who had stood by him, fought for him, and was now nursing him back to life. His grip on her wrist gentled, his thumb stroking her skin. The lines of their desperate bargain had vanished, replaced by the profound, unspoken truth of a real marriage. Caelan's recovery was slow, confining him to the ranch house. This forced stillness deepened his partnership with Cordelia, their days filled with quiet conversation and shared plans. But their fragile peace was soon shattered. Bartholomew Thorne began his attack, not with guns, but with gold. He choked their supply lines, pressured the bank in Redemption Creek to revoke their credit, and bought the loyalty of the freight agent. It was a slow, deliberate siege designed to starve them out. The final blow came on a blistering afternoon. A slick lawyer from the territorial capital arrived, flanked by Gideon Reed and his hired guns. He served Kalen a court order, a document stating that Thorne had legally purchased the water rights to the Serpent River, which bordered their land. They were now forbidden from using the river that was the lifeblood of the ranch. It was a death sentence delivered on a piece of paper. "You're finished, Blackwood," Reed sneered, his eyes lingering on Cordelia. "Mr. Thorne is prepared to take back his property, including his fiancée." "This is our land," Cordelia retorted, her voice shaking with fury, "and I am his wife." Reed laughed. "You have until sundown tomorrow to clear out," he warned. "After that, we'll enforce the court's decision." Despair settled over the ranch, but Kalen, leaning heavily on a crutch, refused to break. "My father did not die for this land, so I could hand it to a man like Thorne," he declared to his small crew. "He may have the law, but we have the land. We'll give him the fight he wants." His courage was a fire that burned away their fear. Using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, Kalen directed their defense from the porch, drawing a map in the dust. They would use the narrow canyon, the only approach to the river, as a kill zone. As the sun set the next day, Reed's dozen riders rode confidently into the canyon. The trap was sprung. Rifle fire erupted from the high ridges where Hector and Gus were hidden, sowing chaos. Kalen, positioned by the house, fired with deadly precision. When one attacker broke through and charged the porch, it was Cordelia who raised her rifle and fired, stopping him in his tracks. Enraged, Reed finally spotted Kalen's vulnerable position and charged, his pistol blazing. Kalen, hampered by his broken leg, couldn't bring his rifle around in time. Just as Reed loomed over him, a single, sharp rifle shot echoed from the darkness. Reed grunted and tumbled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining gunman fled. From the direction of town, Sheriff Brody emerged, a smoking rifle in his hand. "A man's got to draw a line somewhere," the weary sheriff said. "Thorne went too far. Murder is a federal matter. It's over, Kalen. You've won." Dawn broke over a landscape scarred by the night's violence. Sheriff Brody had taken Gideon Reed's body and the wounded men back to town, assuring Kalen that with a federal matter on his hands, Bartholomew Thorne's influence was finally broken. The war was over. As Hector and the others worked to erase the signs of battle, a profound quiet settled over the ranch, the silence of survival. Inside, Cordelia tended to a graze on Kalen's arm. The fight had exhausted him, but his spirit was unbroken. After she helped him to his bed, he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Cordelia, however, walked out onto the porch and watched the sunrise. This land, once a terrifying wilderness, was now her home, a place she had fought to defend. She thought of her arrival, a desperate fugitive making a pact with a stranger under a setting sun. "You need an anchor, and I need a wall," he had said. The wall had held, and the anchor had become the mooring for her soul. The man she had married out of fear had become the man she loved. Late that evening they sat on the porch once more. The setting sun painted the sky in gentle hues, a stark contrast to the brutal crimson of their wedding day. "The first time we sat here," Cordelia began, her voice steady, "you offered me a job. The terms were that I marry you by sunset." She met his gaze, her heart aching. "The sun is setting now. The danger is past. Our contract is fulfilled." She had to give him the choice. "You are free of your obligation. If you wish for me to leave, I will understand." Kaelin was silent for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. "When I made that offer, I told you it was a business proposition," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's not the truth anymore." He reached out, his hand covering hers. "I told you I needed a wall, but I was wrong. A wall keeps things out. What this ranch needed, what I needed, was a partner. You did more than make this ranch look permanent, Cordelia. You made it a home." The sincerity in his eyes held her captive. "The contract is fulfilled," he repeated softly. "So let's make a new one, not born of desperation, but of choice." He squeezed her hand. "Stay, not as my shield or my partner in business. Stay as my wife, my true wife." The last of the sun's light vanished, and in the twilight, a new promise was offered. It was a promise not of survival, but of a future. A promise of a life built not on a desperate pact, but on a love that had grown silently and stubbornly in the harsh, beautiful prairie. Looking at the man who was truly her husband, she saw her home. "Yes," she whispered, the single word full of everything the first one had lacked. "Yes, Kaelin, I'll stay." And so, the story of Cordelia and Kaelin Blackwood, which began with a desperate bargain at sunset, found its true beginning in the quiet promise of a new dawn. Theirs was never a tale of love at first sight, but something far more real and enduring. It was a love forged in the crucible of the Wild West, built from shared danger, mutual respect, and the slow, steady realization that two broken, solitary people could come together to make an unbreakable whole. They had faced down the greed of a powerful man and the prejudice of a narrow-minded world, proving that a home is not just a piece of land, but a fortress you build in the heart of another. Their story became a quiet legend in the territory, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings can lead to the most profound and lasting love. Thank you for listening to this story. If their journey resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story of resilience and unexpected love, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of the West. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite part of Cordelia and Kaelin's story. Until next time, stay safe and keep your powder dry.